Okay, well, hello and welcome everyone who's watching us. Welcome to today's panel. So I'll introduce myself right off the bat. My name is Felix. I am lucky enough to work at WAVAW Rape Crisis Center. I'll offer an acknowledgement or territory acknowledgement for myself first, because I'm not on the same territories as WAVAW. So I am over here on the unceded and ancestral territories of the Lekwungen speaking peoples of the Esquimalt, Songhees, and WSÁNEĆ nations. So colonially, that is known as Victoria, BC. As I said, I work at WAVAW. So WAVAW is across the water in a different territory. So WAVAW is on the territory of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, which is colonially known as Vancouver, BC. Yeah, so I'm lucky enough to work at WAVAW as our manager of social change. WAVAW is a rape crisis center that has been around for about 40 years, and our whole jam is supporting survivors and shifting society. So today, specifically, we're here to talk about sex work, and specifically the relationship between sex workers and the feminist anti-violence sector. So as some folks might know, back in 2018, WAVAW published an apology to sex workers for a harmful stance and rhetoric that we'd previously published. And since I think it's fair to say that repair is a feminist value that's informed by many of the underrepresented communities that we work with, we like to talk about this. And in the spirit of moving into better relationships with sex workers and demonstrating that, even for old and established organizations like WAVA, been around for 40 years, pretty established place, that it's still actually okay for us to shift and to pivot when we see that we've made mistakes. So I won't step on too much of what I'm going to ask Dahlia about, but I think a big learning for us was that, just because you've been doing something one way for 35, 40 years doesn't mean you can't switch it up and do something different. And in fact, that's how we keep organizations and movements alive. So since 2018, we've been working WAVA's work to deepen connections and learn from sex workers. And now, as we're moving into 2023, we're looking at some next steps in order to increase our service and advocacy for sex workers. So with that in mind, let's get into it. I've got 3 awesome panelists here. So what I'm going to do, rather than like introducing everybody and then getting into the questions, I'm going to introduce you folks one at a time. And then I'm going to ask you a first question so you get a chance to speak to our audience right off the bat. So the first person I'm going to introduce is Aline. Sorry, I had a frog in my throat. So Aline is an activist, community organizer, educator, and human rights defender. She's been involved in the sex worker, migrant, labor, gender, and racial justice movements for over 20 years. She's the founder of Butterfly, Asian and Migrant Sex Worker Support Network, and has used diverse and innovative approaches to advocate for social justice for migrant sex workers. She holds a Master of Law and Master of Social Work. She's also a PhD candidate at McMaster University School of Social Work, studying the harm of the anti-trafficking movement. So Aline, I've got our first question for you, and then I'm going to stop talking and let you talk for a minute. So the first question is this: what is your understanding of the relationship between feminists and sex workers? Where have there been ruptures, and where is there solidarity?
Yeah, I think this is really my honor to be here. And I think this is really great. We have a chance to talk about, the relationship with feminists, particular feminist organization and sex worker. And I think this is very interesting. When I first moved to Canada in 2013, because I came from Hong Kong, and in Hong Kong, sex worker group get a lot of support from the women organization. But when I came here, it's like suddenly, oh, what happened? Why all the women group, they say they care about women and keep advocating, more police, advocating to criminalize sex work, and also shut down the Asian massage parlor. So, and I think that is really is something is shock for me, but actually is really this has been long history. Many feminist organizations, I actually don't call them feminist organizations because they love police and the prison more than the women. Like some women organization, particularly they lead by the middle class women, they have very strong relationship with police, and particular white women, they have strong relationship with politicians. They are very powerful. They may have very different experience with the criminal system. They have very different experience with violence. They have very different experience with police, and particularly many of them having the strong moralistic agenda that they really think sex work should not exist. Even some of them frame this is a feminist position, but when you look at what happened behind, is actually more like moralistic view. They think sex work should not exist. And generally, I think some group is really having the very anti-sex work perspective. But I think because of the anti-trafficking movement, some of the group and folks actually, they really support women's rights. They also feel that is so right? So because anti-trafficking movement, sometimes they use candy, to web the policing, because they talk about human rights of women, the liberation of women, anti-slavery. And I think this also makes a big group of the people in the middle that they really want to support women's rights. They are more on the other side. So that's why I think for last few years, Butterfly worked very hard, to have the dialogue with those organizations that they are willing to listen to the sex worker group and have the communication. And we are so glad to see some of the group has changed the position, particularly WAVAW. I don't know, am I pronounce the organization name? And I think a few years ago when I heard about the apologize, I think this statement is so powerful, because in the world we keep learning we need to keep listening. And I think having the courage to apologize, to, to recognize the harm, I think this is so important. And to be honest, this statement I often use to send it to other women organizations, no matter they are silenced with the sex worker position or they have explicit position to anti-sex work or pro-criminalization of sex work. So, and I think this is a very, very important step in last few years. Like, for example, Canadian Women Foundation, they are taking more supportive sex worker approach. LEAP have released the statement, like the feminist legal organization, that they are support the decriminalization of sex work. And we also hear like YIFRI, they say they are against put women in the prison, but they have been support the criminalization of sex work, that sex workers are put in the prison, right? So, and I think that we are happy to see the change, but it is really not easy. And so we still hope that if the group is really support the sex worker rights and really support the women rights, and that supporting sex worker rights is so important. And I think that an intersectionality lens is so important, particularly how LGBTQ community being left behind, disability, not only sex worker, many other group is like being excluded in the women movement. And I'm so glad to be here and talk about this. And thanks again for including us. And thanks again, your courage to make this important change of the position and your relationship with the sex worker community. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Lena. This is already such a good panel. I feel like just on what you just said, we could probably talk for 2 hours. But yeah, like what stood out to me from that is for myself, I'll just interject myself a little bit too. I came into WAVAW at a time when we were really trying to do better for queer and trans community. And one of the first things that we found was that you actually can't do that without doing better for sex workers at the same time. So like you said, Aline, there's really this way that feminist and especially feminist anti-violence sectors have been taken up by folks who have the most access to things already. Like we're talking about cis, white, straight women, and really centering on their analysis and their needs to the exclusion of a lot of other groups. So it's really not surprising that like as we're trying to do better for underrepresented communities, sex work was something that came up super naturally, and we found we really needed to make that shift. Anyways, I'm talking all over Dahlia's point, so I will not do that anymore. Next up, I'm going to ask the same question to Kit. So Kit is a former sex worker and a non-binary, queer, white, Jewish, and multiply disabled settler hailing from Treaty 7 territory in what is known as Calgary. They spent 16 years in Jojoke, aka Montreal, where they started working in sex work in 2002 and started advocating for the rights of sex workers in 2013 as a board member at Stella L'Ami de Memi. They moved to Kemkemalai, aka the Downtown East Side of Vancouver in 2017, and have been at Pace Society in various roles for nearly 6 years. They are currently the community co-executive director at Pace and volunteer as a board member at Pivot Legal Society. So Kit, same question to you. What's your understanding of the relationship between feminists and sex workers? Where have there been ruptures and where has there been solidarity?
Certainly. Thanks so much for having us. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak. I'll just dive right in, I guess. My understanding of the relationship between sex workers and feminist spaces is that it's quite broken as a relationship. Certainly, as Aline just said, first and second wave feminism was not inclusive. And while it made progress for white women, it literally left everyone else behind, including BIPOC folks, lesbian, gay, bi, queer people, drug users, sex workers, two-spirit, transgender, non-conforming folks, the whole meal deal. Everybody got left behind. So while we're like well into postmodernist and supposedly more inclusive waves of feminism now, the harms really remain. In a lot of ways, the movement against trans inclusion has only grown more vociferous and violent, especially in recent years. And along with it, sex work exclusionary forms of feminism, which I don't also really think are feminism, have been even more entrenched. And for example, like look at JKKK Rowling and Julie Bindel, who neither of them have any experience, but continue to speak over people all the time. Instead of being cognizant of the structural issues that really marginalize many in feminist organizing spaces and working to redress those issues, many feminists have forgotten, I think, that sex work is a choice that people can make in the face of structural oppression that provides them with more agency, choice, as well as, in some cases, greater financial security. Sex workers have been left out of prior waves of feminist organizing because of pervasive beliefs that sex work is bad, wrong, that workers are selling themselves instead of a service, and because society more generally are quote unquote like offended by sex work and believe it to be immoral or unethical. So really, it's a relationship in deep need of fairly urgent repair. A lot of second wave feminists, such as Andrea Dworkin, claim that any and all pornography causes all women to be lowered to the status of a quote unquote brothel slut. And that's a really, I think, terrible oversimplification of an industry that is as complex as human desire, and it's wildly denigrating to sex work and the people who are doing it. Oddly, where there could be solidarity, there seems to be still like kind of a consistent rebuke of sex workers from feminist organizing spaces in the realm of anti-trafficking, the reproductive justice movement, and more. And I think the overarching structure of feminism really is at fault because it mirrors white supremacist and patriarchal practices of gatekeeping, tone policing, and it often pits groups against each other in a divide and conquer sort of way. And it presumes that once we've won rights or safety for the majority, that there's no one else to win rights for. And it's the same way that the fight for gay rights and liberation chose not to notice that trans people were being left behind. Specifically speaking about the situation in Canada, I think back in 2014, during the Harper years, when the Bedford Challenge had just finished, a lot of feminist organizations federally and provincially seemed to really believe that Canada's new laws would protect sex workers, despite the many voices telling them that actually these laws make us just as unsafe, if not more so, as previous legislation. I think the most recent split was in 2014. Like in reality, the laws that we have, which often are referred to as the Nordic model, actually create a system of asymmetrical criminalization. However, if you criminalize our clients, you're still criminalizing sex workers. So current laws prevent workers from organizing, sharing collective workspaces, hiring security, drivers, or receptionists, all of which would actually make us more safe. And all of that, I think, has really been sort of like ignored. As it stands, the laws in Canada are still really detrimental to sex workers' safety and rights. However, during the most recent legal challenge, which was heard just this summer at the Ontario Superior Court, which was brought by the Canadian Alliance for Sex Work Law Review, there were some major players, as Aline said, in the federal feminist organizing spaces like eFry and Canadian Women's Foundation and LEAF, who decided to sort of shift their stances and back the alliance. So that might be the most recent bridging of the gap and building of solidarity. And I think I'll stop talking there because otherwise I'll just keep going.
Awesome. Thanks, Kit. Yeah. And I mean, what I've always appreciated about PACE Society is, I mean, you guys are on the ground doing the work with people every day. And then there's this like advocacy piece as well. So I feel like you're speaking very well to the structural ways that feminist movements have showed up to like advocate for shitty laws and like that like policy level harm that happens in addition to the kind of day-to-day stuff. So thank you for bringing that lens. And of course, you know, moving towards repair as well.
Yep.
Okay.
That's the hope.
That's the hope. Yeah, that's what we're here for today. Last but not least, I will introduce Dalia. So Dalia Israel has been executive director of WAVAW Rape Crisis Center since February of 2019. Previously, she managed WAVA's victim services, volunteer inclusion, and outreach program, a position she held since 2012. She started her journey with WAVAW in 2005 as a victim service medical support worker. So she has done just about everything that there is to do at WAVAW and has been with us for a very long time. So I was excited to invite Dalia to speak to kind of the journey that WAVAW has been on over these many years. So Dalia, same question to you, talking about the relationship between feminists and sex workers. Where has there been rupture and where is there solidarity?
Awesome. Thank you. I've been just sitting here fangirling, listening, and now I need to actually think. Yeah, is so thrilled to be here. Really feel like this is such a beautiful reflection of the work that we've all done to just like hold each other in grace. To be able to be here when there has been rupture is just, I think, a milestone within itself. And so honoring both Aline and Kit for the grace to be willing to accept the invite to have this conversation as well. So I think at the end of the day, what I want to say is that the ways in which I believe the white liberal feminists who have been really instructive in the nonprofit industrial complex have acted in wildly paternalistic ways, which really, like Elaine was saying, comes from a rescue model that is deeply entrenched in white supremacy, which is kind of the opposite of all of the things that we purport to do as feminists. And Felix, I think about the horseshoe that we often talk about, where, you know, the further progressive we get, we sometimes meet the very far right. Because even if we are to take a moralistic stance, we're saying that people need to be rescued, but at the same time, we're advocating to believe survivors, to fight for bodily autonomy, for all of these things. And, you know, when you step back and think about it, like those things can't coexist. And if we want to resist Andrea Dworkin's version of the world, which is basically that as long as systemic oppression exists, none of us who are of marginalized genders will be able to ever experience pleasure or ever experience bodily autonomy. We got to start somewhere. And so I think for me, within the organization on this journey, it's been that middle road that Elaine was talking about, where for a long time we thought we were doing things in the interest of women who could not make decisions for themselves. But, you know, the irony, of course, and what we said in the apology was like, you can't advocate to believe people and to fight for their autonomy and at the same time refuse to listen to sex workers who are saying, you're actively harming me. You're actively not allowing us to show up for each other when we know that we are the things that are going to keep ourselves safe. We cannot rely on these systems. And of course, we knew that people couldn't rely on systems, carceral systems, because we are actively always fighting to make those systems more available to people. So it's all of the information that we knew. I think that having the ability to humbly come to the table to continue to want to do better is the ways in which we will continue to hopefully make repair. And by no means do I think that we've got it all right, or that we can move towards anything that looks like perfection. But you know, I think as long as we're constantly interrogating how we're showing up, and being clear about what we actually want to be embodying in our work and our analysis and the ways that we show up in community, I do believe that repair is possible.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Delia. Yeah, I remember I was just, as you were speaking, bringing myself back to a time where I had the first realization that, like, you know, I was a little baby feminist, volunteer at WAVA, as a lot of folks are. I had my big feminist awakening at the WAVA coffee table. Anyways, I was just bringing myself back to that time and remembering the first time I realized, like, oh, this feminist movement is not in alignment with sex workers. And I'm imagining that for, you know, some folks who might be watching this stream, this might be the first time that you're hearing that, because it makes a lot of sense that feminists and sex workers would be working together. So it can be a bit of a shock when we realize that we're not as aligned as we might like to be. So with that in mind, Delia, I'm curious if you can tell us, we've been talking around it a little bit, but tell us a little bit more about WAVA's 2018 apology to sex workers. It was a while ago now. Like, I was also trying to bring myself back there. So as much as you can remember, like, what led up to it? You've spoken a little bit already, but like, what were the sticking points that got us misaligned with sex workers in the first place? And yeah, what happened? What was it like to move through those things as an organization and come out the other end with the apology that we did?
Yeah, thanks. It's an interesting thing. I feel like I remember different parts of the journey along the way, depending on my position in the organization. So when I started at WAVA in 2002 as a volunteer, we had a very close relationship with PACE. We did a lot of work with them on some of their curriculum building. I hung out lots with Raven and Marika back in the day. And then And at that time, WAVA didn't have a position, quote unquote, on sex work. Our volunteer program really had sex workers integrated. People who I went through my cohort with were sex workers. They actually went on to work at PACE. And then as things moved along towards the Olympics, I would say, in 2010 in Vancouver, people kept pushing us to, probably started in 2008, started really pushing us to take a position. And I think at that time, it really was the moralistic piece, because also at the same time, the pieces were happening around Picton here locally, and so many missing and murdered women. And there was a sense of like, we have to take a stand that is on side with the sacredness of women. And at that time, we were also, our service user population was cis and trans women solely. And so there was a real desire to anchor into this notion. And that's why I think, what Elaine said is so important, is that the slip into the morality piece around that sacredness equals people who are not doing sex work is the subtext instantly, right? It's like you are, yeah. So I think we got really hooked into that. And there was also the conversation around like, people don't have agency, they're being exploited, they don't have choice, and therefore that is violence. And that conflation happens pretty quick, right? And if you're not discerning and able to step back and really think it through, organizations can start to move everything in that direction, right? And I think I shared with folks as we were prepping for the panel, like at some point along the way in the past 5 to 7 years, having sex workers say to me, like, we are going to be the people that keep us safe around exploitation. We are the best suited. And if y'all keep taking away the power and the ability to show up for each other because you're making all of these pieces completely illegal by advocating for these laws to be this particular way, this Nordic model, like you are the people who are responsible for keeping pockets of exploitation up. And so those conflations, I think, happened when we were really pushed to take a stance, and then it just solidified after that. And there was a lot of conversations that really were anchored in that. And so, acknowledging that I've been along for that ride, acknowledging that I've been also part of that harm to community, it felt really important in 2018 to take the step to align the thinking and the actions, and ensure that we were also recognizing the harm that we had caused. And that was really painful, but also like really necessary, because obviously the harm that people had been experiencing for not being able to reach out to us when they needed us, not feeling like they could call when they had experienced sexual violence, in the ways that they determined sexual violence, not the way we determined it, was even more painful, so yeah.
Thanks, Dahlia. Yeah, and I'm taking myself back to 2018 as well, which I was pretty brand new and a working role at WAVA at the time. And one thing that I've always really appreciated about working at WAVA is that we have the space to have those kind of conversations internally first. So I'm saying this in the interest of like, if there's other feminist organizations out there listening to this and thinking we might want to do something similar, my best piece of advice would be like, have the tough conversations on your team first. We carved out, there was relationships in place where we were able to have like pretty frank and like difficult and like deeply imperfect conversations with each other, laying like pretty solid groundwork, so that I remember by the time the apology went up in 2018 and we like officially kind of shifted our stance towards decriminalizing. I remember the day we all sat around and talked about it, and it was like completely unanimous. It took us 5 minutes to come to that decision, like when the moment came, because we've been able to do that groundwork for like months and months leading up to it. So by the time it was on the internet, it was like we were all feeling really solid on it, which was a really cool experience. Yeah. I'm going to go off book a little bit and ask you folks, Kit and Eileen, if you take yourself back to that time, like Dahlia mentioned, around the Olympics. And I'm wondering what that kind of looked like from the side of sex workers, seeing feminist organizations move, like, or I don't even know if this was the thing, but like, was it an experience of seeing feminist organizations move further away from sex work around that time? Or did it feel like something different for you folks?
I mean, okay, so I wasn't living in Vancouver at the time, but what I do remember of 2010 was a lot of anti-trafficking hysteria, much like happens with the Grand Prix. People were like, oh, the Olympics, it's going to increase trafficking, it's going to do all this stuff, which I don't think there's any like data to prove that. But it is like a talking point that gets recycled every time there's a big sporting event or a big something. And so to me, that was the thing that I remember most around that period.
Thanks, Ken.
Yeah, I just think this, like the human trafficking thing, is a big giant force, you know, to make the anti-sex worker agenda to package in other form, right? So that like they become a human rights issue, they become a progressive issue. But when we look back the anti-trafficking movement history, so that how the like the state particularly to use it to control racialized people, to criminalize to impose migrant control, to control sex workers, to criminalize it. And the recent, like, you know, from 2000 is like how US government to use it to expand the imperialism to many, many countries, right? And then it's come back to Northern America. So at that time, I'm not in Canada, but it's also happened in Asia. A lot of panic of like human trafficking. They use spot game, you know, to accelerate, because media can use it to create a moral panic. They can earn a lot of money, and many celebrity and also like activists, you know, they can get a lot of support funding. And I just see this anti-trafficking industry can be like so powerful. And I think many people know about the nonprofit industrial complex, but I think with the level of attention, funding, and then because they co-opt so many different movements, right? They co-opt feminist movement, they use the language of anti-slavery, you know, like they also use the language of human rights, you know, so that become a very successful movement to cover up the real agenda is increase like policing, increase like the expansion of prison, and also the control of the sex and sexuality of women, right? Particularly, we see how the anti-trafficking narrative is so successful imposed to racialized, particularly Asian migrant. And so because they are, you know, just like Dali said, the label is so easy to put on them, you know, they know nothing, so they don't speak English, so that's why they cannot consent. Even they say they are not the victim, they're too victimized, they don't know they are victim, right? So that to take advantage of that, and then to have the growth of the using the anti-trafficking movement to achieve the anti-sex work agenda. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Okay, so I'm like, again, I'm placing myself back there in time. We're doing a lot of time traveling today. And I'm thinking that, you know, because there was this deep rupture between the anti-violence sector and sex workers, I often like to imagine, like, I feel like we missed out on some really important lessons from sex workers. And I often think like, how might things look different for us now? And like our programs, our services, the way we talk about sexualized violence, what might have looked different if we'd been in good relationship with sex workers all along? So the next question I have is for Aline and Kit. So what is the anti-violence movement missing when we talk about consent and bodily autonomy? And what do sex workers have to add to this conversation? Whoever wants to go first.
Okay, fine, I'll go. Okay, so I think I feel like I should start off by saying that when we're talking about feminists who are doing like causing harm, it's not all feminists, like talking about not all men, but whatever. Not all feminists. There are lots of feminist organizations and individual feminists who are like actually doing the work. And that's great. And I think having conversations like this is a great way to start shifting perspectives away from notions of rescue or other paternalistic assertions that anyone could or should dictate or critique how any one person is able to eke out a survival under capitalism. I think it would be sometimes maybe more useful to think of it as misunderstanding as well as maybe what's missing. Because while sometimes people have all of the pieces of the puzzle, they still put it together wrong. Mainly, I think what feminists misunderstand is that sex work is a choice, that not all sex work is violence, that people have consent within the sex work that they do. Certainly, if it's devoid of consent, it's not sex work. There's a very commonly committed fallacy that denies sex workers a voice or agency because they have some moral quandary about sex work. But however people feel about the work doesn't matter. It's still a valid form of income generation that people consent to, and they need to access the same kinds of supports and resources as everybody else. I think maybe the biggest piece that's missing from conversations around consent is that often sex workers have more agency, options, or opportunities for meaningful consent than laborers in many other sectors. And it's why so many people opt to earn their living in the sex industry. They're also, I think, misunderstanding or missing that structural pieces that push people into this work, and they're disempowering those folks by speaking over them about their own lived experiences. And those include the overlapping oppressions of like colonialism, capitalism, imperialism, racism, transphobia, misogyny, and disability. All of those pieces need to be really carefully examined, deprogrammed, and reprocessed, I think, before taking aim at individuals who are just trying to survive, care for their families, and get home safe. We did a recent survey, I guess, going back now at the beginning of COVID like 2 years ago. And we found that the most commonly found thing between all of our members is disability. And so like collectively, all across, organizing spaces and activist spaces, we could be building coalitions that would push for, let's say, an amelioration of disability benefit supports, moving towards UBI, working together to ensure people never have to stay in personal or professional abusive or exploitative situations out of financial necessity. But instead, those conversations aren't really happening or are siloed in much smaller communities where less collective power is held. So I think we maybe need to be addressing structural problems that allow these situations to occur. And doing so means that sex workers have to be included in those discussions from the ground up. And I think bridging the gap of like knowledge and understanding requires some understanding and acknowledgement that end demand legislation, aka the Nordic model, isn't working. And it was never intended to keep sex workers safe. It was intended to keep society safe from the harms of being exposed to sex work. So I think it means in part understanding that even if structural issues were somehow magically improved overnight, some people can and still will consent to doing sex work to earn a living. I think what a lot of feminists misunderstand most is that sex work is a lot like other forms of care work. And maybe this is for me, like just really, really clear because I worked as a nurse for about as long as I was a dominatrix. And I can tell you sincerely that those two careers share so many similarities and overlap on everything from physical tasks to expected non-judgmental approach, being knowledgeable about risks and harm reduction, and the list goes on and on and on. And to me, it makes total sense because I've done both of those jobs. I know how similar they are. And I really think that no matter what anybody is doing, no matter what sort of industry they're working in, they deserve respect and safety and like workplace protections. However, despite having so much in common, those two careers, disclosing one of those jobs gives me stigma, while the other one gets me praise. And I wish people could just understand it as clearly and cut and dryly as I do, that no matter what industry you're working in, people still deserve care, respect, and safe working environments. And finally, I think the thing that's maybe most misunderstood is that sex workers aren't seeking rescue. Many people are empowered by the work that they do and are rightly offended when people try to tell them they should do something, anything else to earn a living. Because if you aren't replacing someone's lost income, any pretense at rescue will always fall short of meeting sex workers' actual needs. So I think that's it. Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much, Kit. Yeah, I always not always, but I sometimes shake my head at like the lengths that we'll go to not talk about capitalism. This sort of like insidious, it's everywhere, but we can't talk about it thing where exactly like you said, Kit, like how many of us are like meaningfully consenting to work in the first place? Any kind of work to this threshold that we as feminists like to hold sex workers to for like what qualifies as meaningful consent. Oh my God, like the hoops you have to jump through and the standards that we consider necessary to say like, yeah, sex work is an okay thing or that people are meaningfully consenting. We would never take those standards and apply it to something like nursing or like even more exploitative jobs. Like, I don't know, I worked in a warehouse before, like a factory and stuff. And when I think about what it means to sell your body, you know, I think about the lower back pain that I have from working labor jobs. Or I think about like the shoulder pain that I have sometimes from being like a mover, a house mover for a while. And so to me, like the criticism of capitalism is so important in that it allows us to imagine like how many of us are meaningfully consenting to any of the work we do. And when we see it through that lens, it becomes a lot easier to recognize the like pearl clutching that happens around sex work and like sex in general in our culture. Anyways, that's my 2 cents. I want to pass it over to Aline and ask you the same question.
Yeah, I think both of you what say is so right? So, and I think particularly what we see, the problematic of like particularly the anti-violence movement turn into like more social service oriented and also like the professionalization. So like that, and also the narrative is some people is the expert of other people's life, right? So that they can define that, oh, I know that this is not good for you. I know that like you experience violence, you are too ignorant, you don't know. It's the change of the power difference. Even we often hear say like client center, but I think that kind of power difference also make it possible, you know, that systematically someone have power control other people life to define, make the definition of other people's life, right? And I think for many VAW organizations, like many feminists, they do not see the complexity of the people's life and try to very simplify. This is abuser, this is being abused, and also this situation for me, you know, someone take money from sex worker, that must be exploitation. Instead of to look at the complexity of power relation, to look at the complexity of the people's life, right? And particularly for racialized, migrant, and you know, poor, low income people, women particularly, or trans folk, so that when they have very limited life option. So I also often use the term decision making, right? So that like that they may have very limited option for doing sex work is often better than many kind of other job. That's why people choose to work there, right? So no matter massage parlor or sex industry. So they can work with the people who talk to the same language. They do not need the immigration status to start working, you know. And some of people feel actually they have more agency. They can make decision about the work hour. And I think sometimes it's very challenging for people to understand, you know, sometimes people say, you see, this sex worker works 24 hours in the place, so this must be exploited. Of course, we have like some kind of labor standard in our mind, right? But then if we don't understand, actually the people decided and having 24 hours working, they don't need to move around, so that they think it's maybe better option that they have the in and off, they need to travel, right? So that instead of just take away people option, how we can create, you know, different kind of option. Maybe that person cannot afford extra housing, so they prefer to live in workplace, right? Instead of taking the way of learning living. So what is the other option that people can have a place, you know, they can, you know, have other place to rest if she wants, but some people really, you know, that is not something they want. That and I think that the complexity, understanding that may be the best option for that person, or, you know, the only option, but this is still an important decision making. In your eyes is oppression, but for that other person, that may be already resistance, right? So, and I think that instead of, as I keep saying, take away the option, people do sex work, massage work, and earn the living, how we create more options, just like kids say, how to improve the social system. You know, people can have different alternative. They can how to get information. They can decide what workplace they want, right? And particularly before the criminalization of sex work in 2013, even before it's also criminalized for migrant sex workers, we often hear in 2013, 14, they are very easy to find the advertisements, someone hires something. So it means if the worker have the very bad boss, it's very easy. They open a newspaper, they can call and then find other employer, or other worker can refer them to different places, right? So this is the power they can get, they can have, to change the working condition. Or like in Toronto, have 400 massage parlors. So one massage parlor is not good, they can go to the other one, or they can start their own one, right? But like now, Newmarket, they shut down all the massage parlors, they protect them. Actually, you just make them be more underground. So there's, I think, understand the complexity of people, like particularly having the intersectionality lens, how people, different identity, race, gender, income, class, and immigration status, and then how it limited the people option, but at the same time, how people is using it to resist. And I think this is very important when we look at the body autonomy, right? Instead of putting your own standard and trying to understand the complexity. And particularly, I really see how the exiting program itself is so violent. So many anti-trafficking or anti-violence organization, they run the exiting program. When you decide someone must exit, there's no difference with the conversion therapy. They think you're bad. I know better for you that you need to listen to my direction. This is itself is the violence against the body autonomy. The law now is criminalize sex work. They rather you die than rather you do sex work that is violates the body autonomy of the worker. And so I talk a lot, but I really feel like I don't know how to explain, the shift of the violence against women, like anti-violence women, because when I was in high school, it's like more liberating. We hear more organization, they talk about how, people have agency, my body, my choice, and sex is more celebrating. We have a lot of workshop talk about this, but now it's often, I hear a lot of consent workshop is not tell you how to say yes, right? They keep telling you how to say no. When you only say no, how you can say yes, right? So, and behind who run this workshop, we also often see who are the people getting funding. Is those people may have the moralistic idea. They think, sex and sexuality only perform in a certain way. Even in their mouth, they say, I respect the diversity, but you can see the hidden agenda, how they create the fear, of people's life about sex, sexuality. And I think that if we really want to end the sexual violence and then having the environment and changing the society, sex itself can be powerful, can be liberating. And I think this is very important. I really like what Dalit, you just say, the horseshoe, that when you think progressive and then seems like going back. Yeah, thank you. And I think, like, of course, sex worker is a very good educator, on consent and autonomy, right? So that as he just say, that is something sex workers need to face and need to know very well, how to handle every day.
Yeah, thank you so much. You guys bring, both of you, just like so much to this conversation. And so I'm glad we asked that question, because there is so much that feminist anti-violence has to learn from sex workers. And especially one thing that stood out from what you were just saying is this piece of, in our corner of the work, we do a lot of talking about consent as if it's like a yes or a no. Like, we're going to check the box. Did you get consent? Check a box, yes or no. But what is like something for us to grow into is like a more nuanced understanding of like, what are the conditions under which we say yes or no? Like, I think sex workers have so much to teach us about how the consent is a nuanced thing, that like we can be consenting to sex work as like a really great way to make some money and like give us more agency than like a lot of other industries do. And like, I think the feminist sector has such a more narrow understanding of like consent as being that yes or no, when really, yeah, like if we peel back the layers, there's so much more to it than that I think we've been missing out on for a long time. Cool. Okay.
Maybe I'll just add here the point that Aline just made around like focusing on the no. And that's always been a big thing for me in the work, because it's we never talk about the other side. And it feels like you are a gatekeeper on information for people, right? Like, and I think it's the orientation to the work, because we're focusing on sexual violence, and so much of the time you're looking at that threshold of like how people have experienced their subjective experience of feeling like their boundaries or their bodily autonomy has been annihilated, moved through, ignored, whatever. But I think that's another huge piece of the work that could be so formative and such a huge opportunity for alliance, right? Where we actually get to dive into, you know, we've done lots of presentations on pleasure in the past. And for some folks who have experienced intergenerational trauma and genocide, like pleasure was never something that they've ever experienced in their life. And they've experienced loads of sexual violence. So how do we start to teach towards like that reclamation of bodily autonomy through a liberatory practice of pleasure and starting to learn about yourself? And it feels like the feminist movement and sex workers could work together on that in such beautiful, beautiful ways.
Mhm. Oh, thank you so much, Dahlia. Okay, I have the next question is a little bit different, but we'll just dive right into it. So the next one I have is for you, Aline. So the violence against women sector has traditionally worked alongside the criminal justice system, which has excluded and harmed sex workers. So just a bit of background, if folks who are watching aren't familiar, yeah, there's pretty deep ties between feminist anti-violence and the criminal justice system. That's, I'm sure you'll speak to this better than I will, but dates back to really the foundations of the work that we're doing as a sector, like versus a feminist movement. So in your mind, what is the relationship between criminal justice and sex workers? And what are sex workers doing to keep themselves and each other safe?
Yeah, so I think when we talk about history, it's very interesting. I try to look at the history, you know, of violence against women movement. Actually, at the beginning, is not work with police. It's not work with the criminal system, right? So they are against the police. Actually, they are talking about how community building the power to, you know, to how, you know, like people can speak out. And I think how to remove the stigma, you know, of victims. So, and then how to change the society, be more safe, right? But because like violence against women organization become institutionalized, we see that the relationship, and then who run those organizations, we see many violence against women movement at the beginning is led by racialized people, right? So that, and then when they become institutionalized, just like what we have discussed, is more like white middle class professional, you know, like those kind of caste feminists take up the space to shift, you know, for many organizations. I think I also aware what kids say is not all right, but like those organizations, of course, when they take this approach, you know, support the state, support, you know, the policing, they will get more funding, so that the level of growth and expansion of those kind of work is very different. We see there are still a lot of violence against women organizations. They don't get so much funding, not institutionalized. They are still, you know, against policing, because against like the criminal system, because they are harmful for many people, marginalized, racialized people, and particularly when people experience violence, right? And I think we need to look back. I think what Kate also talk about how, you know, the police system and the criminal system is being created, you know, to uphold the white supremacy, you know, to maintain the colonialization, you know, to target racialized people and migrants, right? So this is this broken system. I'm often being asked how we can fix this system, you know, how to make sex workers believe to trust the police. This is not the system, you know, you can fix, because the police is the system designed to harass, arrest, and harm the sex worker, right? Because they're being defined as social deviants, so they need to be controlled and punished, right? Same as the criminal system. I don't call it criminal justice system, because there is no justice, because the criminal system is being created to keep the power of certain people and keep the rights of certain people by, you know, continues the oppression against different people. And we need to know how the illegality being created, right? So that we know the history, you know, the sex work related law, how it's used to control migrant and indigenous women about their mobility, how to control their sexuality. And until now, it's still the same, right? Sex work law is being used by the police to do racial profiling, and then how they make sex work become illegal in order they can target them, right? But now they just change the language to I protect them, but actually they do the same, right? Still the surveillance, they always go to harass them and also arrest the people. So that's why I think it's very clear this is the system is used to not make the sex worker safe. This is not the system to protect sex worker. It's opposite. So I think Kate also raised some example for migrant sex worker, like because of the language barrier, because of, migration, so that they may not able to access a lot of like resources when they run the business. It's very challenging. They don't have credit card, right? So they need the people to help them, to answer the phone, to screen the client. And they may also need someone, to help them to pay for the advertisement. But all this activity is being seen as illegal. And so that the people helping them is being arrested, and the sex worker themselves, is often work with each other, is also being arrested, right? So that is the system. Say they protect the people, but it's not true. They protect the sex worker. It's not true. This is the system designed to harm them. But the challenge is many violence against women organizations and the people involved, they may not see that this way, right? Some of them is really saying sex work, no one want to be a sex worker, they should be ended. Even that maybe the cost they may be arrested, the cost that they may be suffered, but this is a necessary cost, to have the bigger good, right? That we hear sometimes. That is what I so surprised when we have the lobby of City of Toronto, when they say that they care about the woman, but the law enforcement just came in and asked the woman to take off the clothes to show their underwear. If they have sexy underwear, they think that, oh, you're the sex worker, I can give you more charges. If you are not sex worker, so I will give you tickets. So, but why those organizations, they say they care about the violence against women, they don't say about this, they don't oppose it. Instead, they ask for more law enforcement go to the place, right? Because the real agenda is not care about the safety of the woman. They more care about eliminate this industry. So, and why this Causeway Feminists and police and the criminal system work together so well, because all of them are being like benefit, right? So, and I think this is really, really challenged, because when we push back, it's very difficult, because now they have the beautiful language, say, I care about the safety, I protect the people, I'm not, against sex worker, but the assumption everything is exploitation, that they can use it, to push back. And when we do the lobbying, so in 2020-21, the Ontario government have 300 million for anti-trafficking work. Most of the funding goes to police, and they also passed a bill called Bill 251. So they give the power for law enforcement enter any place, anytime, to take any document and force anyone to talk to them. I can't believe Canada can pass this kind of law. But because in the name of trafficking, they can do it, and no one against it. Even politicians, they say they are against policing. They say, I would be seen supporting human trafficking, and they are being silenced, right? So that's why I think what I want to say is, this is the system designed to harm people, but because of the name saying protection, to make it more difficult to push back. And now we see the police go with the social worker to make their work become legitimate, right? So that is like they are the rescuer instead of harming the people, and that is even more problematic. So that's why for sex worker community, and now with many real abolitionists, right, like the anti-prison, anti-policing abolitionists really develop what is the alternative system, of policing, like what is the transformative justice, people can build, and many people want the people created harm be accountable, right? They need to take responsibility, but is it, we must have police to involve, whether it must have the criminal system to involve. I think many people question it, because not only sex worker, domestic violence, what we see so many people experience violence, they're being arrested, because of this mandatory like arrest, right? So that whether this is a system can help anyone. Yeah.
Thanks so much. You nailed it. Like, what a beautiful, I love the way that you're able to flesh out for us, like the deep connections between the way like social work and feminist anti-violence, like hold each other up with criminal justice, like towards the end of like further oppressing and marginalizing sex workers. Kit, I saw that you looked like you had something to say in there. So I'm going to toss it over to you and ask if you have anything to add.
No, I mean, you're just such a powerhouse, Leland. I love listening to you talk. Every time I hear you speak, I'm like, oh yes, oh, you're right on the nose. Oh yes, yeah, totally, exactly. But I think one of the thoughts that that occurred to me was that like cops are trying to legitimize their work by now working in conjunction with healthcare workers or social workers, but social workers and healthcare workers are also complicit in very carceral institutions, and in child apprehension and in a whole bunch of other things that are like quite involved or like interwoven in all of these struggles. And so I think that was the piece that jumped out most to me, was that like this is not a unique fight, but it always feels like it is, because it feels like often we're yelling into a void to people who are like, we totally want to protect you, and then are doing the exact opposite thing that you request or that you need.
Thanks, Kat.
Thank you. I just want to add, when we talk about criminal system, it's not only criminal law. I use a lot of criminal law as example, but how the immigration policy and municipal bylaw right now, we recently see like how powerful our municipal bylaw can shape the people's life, to impose the policing and like shut down people business, bring in the police, immigration, and then make people suffer, right? So that I think that like the criminalized system is, and as you say, the health system and social work system is also part of this criminalization system that really police people's life and also control the people. Yeah.
I can't wait to read your PhD, Elaine. That's very exciting. I was just gonna say around the point that you made around the legitimizing piece, is I think also how the feminist movement, and particularly the nonprofits that came, the professionalizing of this work, that really resonates, because I think that one of the traps that we fell into was that because women in the 70s and 80s were sitting around talking about the violence that they were experiencing, and patriarchy and the larger society was basically just telling women to be better wives or partners or whatever, to fall in line, and then the violence wouldn't be happening. And it was becoming passed off as a much more kind of individualistic piece instead of looking at it systemically. There was a real push to legitimize the violence as a systemic issue, and the system or the structure that they use to try to legitimize that the violence was serious and real was the carceral system, because that was basically the only thing systemically that they could try to change. And so I see that so much, and I use Brene Brown's hustle for worthiness a lot in this, because it really does feel like for so long the women's movement particularly was saying like, believe us, this is a big problem, and in order for you to show us that you believe us, people need to be carcerally punished. Which we know, again, on that horseshoe, it's like, if we're actually trying to change the conditions that cause harm in the first place so that the violence doesn't happen, doing crime and punishment, like, Foucault, who I love so much, we know that those things are not going to lead to a more peaceful or more whole society, right? And so it's again that place where we start to cycle back to these really kind of moralistic pieces where we're acting in the exact opposite way that we're hoping to act, right? And accountability and community building is way harder than kind of throwing somebody away and losing the key, or not providing them with the things that they need in order to have insight into the harm that they've caused, right? Or getting their needs met if they've got needs that are not being met, and that's why behavior is starting to affect or harm other people. So yeah, I just wanted to tag on to that piece.
No, thanks, Dahlia. I was going to poke you for that if you didn't say it. So you're saying it because it's a conversation that Dahlia, you and I have had a fair amount of times about how there was this struggle to like legitimize domestic violence through the carceral system, which, you know, kind of boils down to, you know, we're going to buy into harmful systems in order for this harm to be taken seriously. Which, Kit, that reminds me of something you said earlier too about the gay rights movement having left behind like largely trans people, because it was really about like, you know, we can get married, we can be the same as you. It feels similar to like, we're going to buy into these harmful systems instead of trying to change them, which I think something similar probably happened with, it's a little bit before my time, but something similar happened with feminist anti-violence and the carceral system. It's like it's all connected. Go figure. Okay. My next question that I have is for you, Kit. And of course, C2 can feel free to answer as well. But so understanding a little bit more now, like what the divergence between feminist anti-violence and sex workers could look like. I'm going to ask you to just imagine with me, what would it look like if that hadn't happened? So what would a sexual assault center look like that was built with sex workers in mind? And how would we talk about sexual assault at that place? And what would our services look like?
Okay, I love this question. I know that this doesn't exist, but I really want it to.
No.
And it should. This should exist. But yeah, okay, so I guess I'll start by saying, like, the sex workers' rights movement appropriated the disability rights slogan of the 1970s, nothing about us without us, for a very good reason. Mainly that often people try and design things like programs or exiting supports or whatever that aren't actually responding to the needs or requests of community. So if you're going to design something with us in mind, you need to include us in the planning, the delivery, and the review at every level of decision making. Anything else is kind of just a best and not often well-educated guess and may not meet the needs of community, and at worst can replicate and continue harming folks in community. So I think if there was such a thing, God, I want there to be such a thing, for sex workers, it would have to be set up, a setup, pardon me, that respects people's confidentiality and privacy. So things like covered windows and securing member data and like very secure servers, or allowing people to participate while maintaining anonymity, working with pseudonyms, whatever it may be. Oftentimes people are not comfortable disclosing the work that they do. And I think having folks that are aware and can talk about sex work and sexual assault in a really nuanced way is really helpful, because while Pace and while myself, we might view a lot of things as sex work, not everybody who's doing that work views themselves as a sex worker. And so really making sure that like people have the safer space to come and disclose what they need to or what they feel comfortable to, and improving that can definitely, or like by way of improving that, making sure that people's confidentiality and privacy are respected. So presuming in this conversation that the preliminary labor has already been invested to learn about sex work and sex workers, and any like apologies or acknowledgements have already been made, then it would be necessary to signal in small ways to folks just who are walking in the door that that's a safer space for sex workers. And so that could be, for example, putting up little red umbrellas, which is the international symbol for sex worker safety and unity, as well as information about sex worker safe resources. All of those things, I think, go a long way towards making it a more welcoming environment for folks. But I think to like take it a step deeper, it's really important to ensure that all of staff volunteers have proper training, and that includes training on destigmatizing and demystifying sex work. And folks, I think, would need to know that people are not at fault for being sexually assaulted under any circumstance, including during the course of their work. So like, while I don't even know when the slut walk started anymore. I feel like I'm so old, I can't remember. But one of the slogans that came out of that was that it's not what she's wearing. And that was pretty easy, I think, for like a broad feminist population to accept. But it still seems that it's really hard for many people to concede that it's also not what they were doing for work. And like, the beliefs need to be grounded in evidence-based research. They need to permeate the language that folks use to discuss sexual assault experienced by people during the course of their work, because sex workers are really good at sniffing out stigma. We encounter it all the time in both subtle and overt ways. And if those biases are still detected when people are trying to access support, sex workers will likely inform their own communities that this is not the safe resource that it hopes to be. I think mainly it would need to provide resources for workers that are properly vetted and can provide competent support from a sex work inclusive and sex positive lens. And it would need to understand that for many people, including sex workers, drug users, two-spirit LGBTQIA folks, and BIPOC folks, police just aren't safe. So it would need to provide supports that aren't directed at funneling people into the criminal or carceral system that never gives them the justice that they want. And it would need also, I think, most importantly, to move beyond colonial notions of justice and take on more like culturally relevant, decolonial ways of addressing harms and creating accountability. So I think the move needs to be towards decrim and then beyond decrim to like really providing ways to address harms instead of crimes. And I think a thing that it would have to do to like really provide safety for sex workers and to be a really good resource was that it would have to advocate for an end to the stigmatization and full decriminalization of sex work. I think that's about all I had in my brain on that one.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Kit. I mean, one way that I think I've heard folks at PACE and elsewhere talk about this is like sex work is not inherently violent, but like criminalization is inherently violent. So if we want to end violence against sex workers, like decrim is like you said, a pretty good place to start. Yeah. Aline, you looked like you were having big thoughts about that. So I want to ask you the same question.
Yeah, I think kids say it so well already. So, and I think that like how to take away, the criminal law and other kind of like unjust by law immigration law is a very important like first step, right? So, but this is not enough because we also see how the sex worker is facing racism, ableism, and so that like all the kind of oppression, so that is also necessary, and particularly anti-migrant, right? So that when you want to end the violence of migrants, so that's why, like for example, status for all, like people can get the immigration status is the powerful way, the people can have more power, for their like conditions. So that is something we need to see and consider. I just want to share the resources. Maybe you can also share with other folks. Butterfly have developed a resource guide on how to support migrant sex workers when they experience the violence. Just like Kit said, how to respect the agency, autonomy of the worker, how to recognize the resilience of the worker, but also like how to work with the worker to create legal and non-legal option, right? So legal is not only criminal option. So there is like different way how to support the people to create different option and offer different kind of support, having anonymous service, not work with law enforcement. And like there are some like story also like information people can have a look. And so I also share statement called A Cause for Justice. So this is the statement after the Atlanta shooting. A spa worker being murdered in Atlanta, 6 workers was being murdered. And we can see how not only sex worker, but like the racialized migrant, and also like trans sex worker are disproportionately being harmed, by criminal system, and also disproportionately including in indigenous sex worker faced by facing the violence. So, and I think having a solidarity, showing the support is very important, and hope you guys will, sign the support statement too. And changing the system is very important, just like Della said, right? That it's very important to change the system, not only trying to stop the action, right? So that like this is very important, like not only talk about how to support the victim, this is very important, but how to change the system to make it not happen, right? So, and I think this is really like important direction we need to move on, and also how to have the alternative, you know, like when things happen, how people can use different way, you know, to respond. And I see there is like growing, particularly in America, and also like in many country, many culture, they already have been using different kind of like system, you know, to resist and also rebuild. And I think that is something we may like need to make more effort to work on this direction. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you. Okay, well, I have one last question that I'm going to ask to everybody, and this is my favorite question of the whole panel. Saved the best for last. So again, just understanding that, like, you know, we're coming to this as an organization who like offered our apology to sex workers, and really, like I said at the beginning, trying to understand that in order to stay alive and relevant and doing good work, you know, movements and especially nonprofits need to be able to shift and change and pivot when we realize that we've done harm. So with that in mind, my question is this, and it's for all of you. In order to be sustainable, movements need to look both externally at systems that we're trying to change and internally at how we reproduce harm ourselves. So the question is, what does good repair look like, and how can feminists work in allyship with sex workers? Maybe I'll ask you first, Alia.
Okay. I mean, I'll just say from like my own personal perspective and the values that I bring to the organization and to my work, I really rely on my ancestral teachings in Judaism around repair, and the fact that, you know, it's one of our teachings, our central teachings, that we have to come humbly to truth telling, to acknowledgement, and to making repair for harms that we've made. Yes, Kit just said atonement. We do that once a year, but hopefully we continue to reflect throughout the rest of the year. But I feel like, you know, I'm sure all of our staff are sick of me saying it, but there are unintended consequences for everything. And if we walk through the world trying to push an agenda without taking pause and thinking about the unintended consequence, harm is inevitable. And so I think for us, really thinking about, you know, not defining safety. We talk about safety all the time, not defining safety from our perspective, but really doing the work of like treating people the way they want to be treated, and investigating with people what safety means for them, what they want it to look like, and how we can support that as people that have more power and privilege and access to information in our sector. How can we be the door openers for people so that they have more information, more opportunities to make different decisions, more information to validate the decisions that they are making, and really be there to be at their back in order to move forward with them. And I think that goes for our analysis, that goes for how that we show up in community, and that when people do call on us to use our privilege and our position as an organization for other movements, that we are really showing up and doing the work of having difficult conversations and inviting folks that we have influence and access to, that we make sure that we're thoughtful about the ways that we use our voice.
Yeah, thanks so much, Alia. And like another thing that you and I have talked about in the past too is like understanding that there's harm happening everywhere in all of our social movements, you know, feminism, you know, I see it happen all the time in gay rights and like queer and trans movements. I know stuff happen like if you're in a movement and you think that you're not causing harm, you're probably wrong. And that's just kind of the nature of the work. And so one thing that I often think about is like, planning from the outset when we're thinking about, making moves in our social locations or like across movements, planning from the outset of like, what's going to happen when we realize that we've caused harm? How are we going to set ourselves up well in order to pivot when that realization comes? It's great to also plan for like trying to cause less harm, or like doing that kind of spotting that you're talking about, and knowing that all of us are walking around the world with blind spots. We're probably all going to mess up at some point. And so the question to my mind is like, how do we position ourselves as folks who have a lot of expertise, but like you said, Dahlia, humbly, and not as the ones who have it all figured out. And so that is like an interesting thing I think about sometimes, as that feels like a really common sense thing. Like, of course, we don't want to position ourselves as knowing everything about everything, because that's not realistic. And like, as a nonprofit too, that can be tough, because there's a lot of pressure in the nonprofit world to show up as the one who knows everything. And Aline, you did a great job earlier of explaining how like that kind of expertise directly impacts how much money we get, like how many services we can offer, because there's these structures in place to keep us in this position of like not moving and not changing our analysis. And we can start to sound a bit like a broken record. So like, one thing I've learned over my time at WAVA is that for us to make this shift and pivot and offer the apology that we did really rubs up against the ways that like nonprofits are set up to work. We also talked today a little bit about how this professionalizing of roles really takes us out of community and like puts us in this like higher up, I know everything kind of position. And so planning to pivot really means planning to push back against the nonprofit industrial complex in a way that is a lot easier said than done. Anyways, that's my rant. I'll ask you two, Kit and Aline, about that question. What does good repair look like, and how can feminists work in allyship with sex workers?
Yeah, I think it's really thing it's not allyship. So sex workers should be included in the feminist movement, should be having the leadership role, but because many sex workers are the greatest feminists, to fight against the patriarchal system. And I think the other thing, not only feminist movement, feminists also should not distance themselves with migrant movement, racial justice movement, disability adjustment, gender justice movement. And I think that how to see each other in each other movement. I think this is very important. It's not easy, but I think at the beginning, I keep asking people to be the allies. And I think now it's not only allies, that you really see that in your movement, sex worker is in your movement, that how you keep create a space that they can speak out in your movement, and how to get each other educated and taking the leadership role. What I see in Canada is like a lot of token, right? Just put a sex worker on the table to be, but how to have the really meaning contribution and collaboration, and having the leadership from the different community, and I think this is something I really hope to see. It's not easy, but I think this is so important. We are not allies of each other. Our life is connected with each other. I think this is more like meaningful and powerful. But of course, we also see what we can't see, right? The limitation of our own experience, like to, that how we create a space, we keep learning from each other. As you say, we may make mistakes, but how to learn more, avoid the harm. But when harm happen, I really appreciate, again, having the courage, taking the step, keep listening, and, having this recognition of the harm and making the change. And I think this is very beautiful, but also very powerful. Thank you.
Someone told me not too long ago that like the great way to like get through many years of working at PACE is just to like stay soft. And to be accepting. And I think that is one of the really big things that like overarching feminist movements need to sort of like sit with, the harm that they've caused and how to repair that. But when it comes to like repairing harm, I think like, okay, so a proper apology consists of 3 parts, and maybe this is old hat and everybody knows it, but first one is acknowledgement of harm. The second is that there's acceptance that there's more to learn. And the third is amends. And so if people really want to build solidarity in their movements and include sex workers, they have to be willing to own that in the past, feminist and feminist orgs have done is a detriment to the lives of sex workers, and they need to make apologies to communities. I know, like I'd been at PACE, I think for about a year when WAVAW's like public apology came out. And I was so excited. Everybody in the office was like thrilled. We were like, this is so great. Who knew this was happening? This is so wonderful. We love that they did this. And I think like that there would be equal amounts of enthusiasm for any like sort of like larger provincial or federal organizations who decided to shift or pivot their previous stances on sex work. I think a big thing that folks need to do is like acknowledge point blank how and what they did that caused harm, what those harms were. I think they need to put learning in place for themselves and their teams that will ensure that those sort of like backslides don't happen again, and that we need to like really center the voices of folks who are the most oppressed in our movements. But I think like where other struggles for justice are concerned, sex workers aren't asking for reparations, but some members of community where that overlaps with BIPOC folks, for instance, are still owed reparations that could potentially increase healing and access for sidelined community members. And I think beyond, like, people aren't really asking for that. What they're asking for is that the anti-violence movement or sector uses its enormous power to be able to support and advocate for the rights of sex workers, for full decrim and for equal protections for all sex workers, regardless of immigration status. So I think like if other feminist orgs, and I really hope that there are considering leaving behind their like past stances on sex work, I'd really encourage them to look at the ways that WAVA has gone about publicly acknowledging the harm, striving to partner with orgs like PACE to sort of like increase their working knowledge and destigmatize sex work and sex workers, educating their teams and volunteers and wider community about how to repair and rebuild those connections. In my mind, WAVA's really gone like above and beyond and is like really actually now using its voice to support sex workers' rights to safety and self-determination. And this is one of those door opening conversations. Certainly, PACE has long been shut out of many conversations in feminist spaces, and having someone hold the door for us is really wonderful. So I think WAVA would be a really good model for people to sort of like replicate their own processes on. And I would be really happy to see more of that happen.
Sorry, I just want to add, like, the Canadian Women Foundation have recognized the harm. They have pulled out, how to say, like before they have done a very harmful anti-trafficking report, they are take it out from their website, but this report still continues being used. Is still don't have like formal apologize, despite they are working very closely to support the sex worker community. Actually, YIFRI do not have the position yet, but they are revisiting their position, so that we hope that they will really listen to the sex worker, to recognize the harm they have done, and also, as you say, how to repair, right? And the other very harmful anti-trafficking organization is the Canadian Center to End Human Trafficking, so that they have been advocating to shut down Asian massage parlor, so that they have like keep advocating like more like castle approach of policing and anti-trafficking, and they post themselves as an anti-trafficking organization helping the people, but actually they are collecting data, for public safety. So, and I think that we still hope like more and more organizations, to learn from history how much harm like they can cause, and so that like as this is really the harm is still every day, is still making people suffer, and they are very powerful, and that's why I think they stop the harm and also like work with the sex worker and restore the harm, and I think that's very important. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'll just say one last thing before we wrap it up for today. We've just recently done kind of a round of community consultation with sex working communities just this past summer. And one thing that came out loud and clear from that was the ask from sex working communities that, like Kate, you were saying, for us to use our voice and to help move along our sector in the directions that we would like to see. And so that is another one of those things that feels easy to say, but is actually like a little bit more complicated because like to my mind, it would feel very easy to just like wash our hands of the harm that is still happening in the feminist anti-violence sector and say, you know, we're going to do something else and like pivot away. But the ask has really been to like stick with our people and stick within our movement and try to make change within it. And so with that, that is an invitation. Like if there are other feminist anti-violence organizations watching our stream today, that's an invitation to you. We're very happy to share more about our experience. You know, we're not afraid of talking about harm that we've done at WAVAW. We're not afraid of like sharing the nitty gritty of what it looked like and where the hard bits were, because I do feel really proud of like where we've gotten to. And so we're happy to stick around and help other folks in our sector move in that direction as well. So yeah, that's an invitation. Reach out if you want to talk about it some more. But yeah, thank you, you three, for being here today. I think this was such a good panel. I'm really appreciative of all of your insight and wisdom and the work that you guys are all out there doing every day. And I hope that folks watching have enjoyed watching and catch us next time on Twitch. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us.
Of course.
Thank you. Thank you. Solidarity.